Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I do want to give the witnesses a heads up. I do intend to ask them questions over the course of this 5 minutes. I spent a dozen years as the chief law enforcement official of my state. I've never claimed to be a cop, not a certified officer, but I had the privilege of serving as our state attorney general. I've had a lot of conversations with law enforcement officers all over the state of Kansas, local cops, elected local officers and sheriffs, cops that worked directly for me under our supervision, cops that worked in local agencies, and all sorts of federal law enforcement officers, as well as federal prosecutors who operated in our jurisdiction. I will tell you, in the course of those 12 years, I never saw an FBI agent perform less than honorably, not once. And I never recall a single time in those rooms. Now, if I'd go down the street to the political party meetings, I'd hear conversations like we heard some today and we've heard a lot over the last 4 years. I'd hear all that all the time. If I turned on the television, I'd see it all the time. I never heard it among cops working a case. I heard folks who knew each other and liked each other and cooperated with each other who said, how are we going to get that child molester off the streets? How are we going to solve this murder? How are we going to deal with that case of elder abuse? How are we going to deal with that crime that's in front of us? That's the FBI I know, and it's the law enforcement world that I know. And I would just ask, Mr. Whitson, you're first up here, is that consistent or inconsistent with the law enforcement community you operated in?
It's absolutely consistent. I'd say I had partners that I worked with for years on cases, and if you asked me what political party those people were in, I couldn't tell you. And they couldn't tell you the same for me when I was in the FBI. So that is the real FBI. When you go out to the field offices and you get away from headquarters, that's the real FBI, the real work. That's what they're like.
And Mr. Stout, you were a local or state officer or both before being federal. How about you? Is what I just described consistent or inconsistent with your experience?
Yes, sir, it is consistent, and I would tack on to that something earlier that Ms. Crockett said that I'm interested in about galvanizing this country. What will bring us all together? Something.
Please do it briefly.
You mentioned there's a special place in hell for pedophiles and child pornographers, and we have systems in place at the FBI, but we can make those systems a little bit better, a little bit tighter. I'm prepared to talk about it later today if you wish.
That sounds very good. Let me tell you a brief story, and then I have some follow-on questions. So during the course of the time I was serving in that role, we had a terrible case. It was a racist, bigoted individual from a neighboring state who crossed the line into our state with the intent of killing a group of folks because of their faith. He went to a religious institution. He shot the place up. He killed, as I recall, 3 people. He was immediately apprehended. He has since died in prison. But there was, at the moment that happened, there was a motivated federal and state through the local authorities response. A lot of folks on the scene, everybody trying to figure out how do we secure this thing, how do we fix it? And then there was a professional discussion. Who's going to go first in the prosecution? Because you had a state murder and you had federal hate crimes, as well as some other federal crimes perhaps. And man, the press loved it. I mean, every day there was a headline about this dispute between the district attorney and the United States attorney and the local cops and the federal cops and who's going to go first. And finally it was decided the state would go first, and the district attorney announced he was filing capital murder charges with a notice of intent to seek the death penalty under our state law. And in the same article where the local press reported that, they then in the next paragraph said, and next, there'll be a decision on a federal prosecution where the penalties may be stiffer. Think about that. Think about that. I offer the story up for this reason. I think there may be a perception outside the cops on the beat, federal and state, who do this work in our communities every single day, that what we talk about up here is reality and that somehow the federal law enforcement officers are superior to their state counterparts. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's close to true. And I don't think what we're hearing today and heard the last 4 years reflects what really happens with the vast, vast majority of the federal and state cops on the beat. And I guess I would just ask this. Mr. Whitson, you suggested we ought to move the FBI out of Washington, D.C., and the current director has already made some moves to that effect. Talk to me in my remaining time about how you think that might affect our ability to get this narrative back on track so it's the cops on the beat keeping our communities safe that drives it instead of all this political circus in this town that drives it.
Well, briefly, just right now, almost a third of all FBI employees are stationed in the D.C. area. The crime that's taking place across America is not all happening in the DC area. It's happening everywhere in pockets all over the country, Kansas, every member's district. And so moving the FBI out of DC and back into the field office is gonna help that. But it's also cheaper. DC is an expensive area. I don't need to tell anyone that, right? Moving the headquarters to a lower cost area is not only cheaper for the federal government and the American taxpayer, but it's also cheaper for the workers. For the federal employees that have to commute every day to the office, if it's in a place that's a better quality of living, an easier commute, that's better. And then the last reason, to be real brief, is the political makeup. And so my colleague at FGA, Hayden DeBlois, did a paper on this to look at federal senior executive employees, what is the political makeup? And across the country, they lean heavily Democrat by 30, but in DC, it goes up to 40. And so that's not to say, not trying to be not Democrat or not Republican, but we really want to put it in a place where it's more representative of the entire country and not just one side of the country. And that's why we see that when a conservative comes in, the whole weaponization rises to the issue because the headquarters is populated by people of the opposite political.
The gentleman's time has expired.